Daniel Brooks had not planned to be on the 32nd floor of the Grand Regent Hotel that Friday evening. He had not packed a suit for the occasion. He had not rehearsed polite conversation about quarterly returns or pre-IPO valuations. He had come to the Grand Regent for one reason, and one reason only, to pick up Marcus Webb, an old college friend who was running late from a meeting in one of the lower-level conference rooms, and to collect his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, who had spent the past 2 hours at a children's orchestra showcase in the hotel's East Wing lobby. That was the entirety of Daniel's agenda for the evening. Nothing more, nothing less. He stood near the elevator bank on the lobby level, one hand resting on Sophie's shoulder while she clutched a small paper program from the concert, still humming something she had heard the young violinists play. She had his dark eyes and her late mother's way of tilting her head when she was deep in thought, and watching her do it now, studying the program like it contained secrets, made something quiet and permanent settle in Daniel's chest. He had learned to carry that feeling without showing it. "Can we get hot chocolate?" Sophie asked without looking up from the program. "After Marcus," he said. "Marcus is always late." "Yes, he is." She finally looked up at him, evaluating. "You're not even a little bit interested in what's happening upstairs." Daniel glanced toward the elevator, where a pair of men in identical black tuxedos waited with expressions of practiced indifference. Through the lobby's high glass walls, he could see the shimmer of a receiving line in the ballroom corridor, above women in architectural gowns, men whose cufflinks probably cost more than his monthly mortgage. A charity gala from the look of it. The kind of event where the real business happened in the corners away from the photographers. "Not even slightly," he said. Sophie seemed satisfied with that and returned to her program. Daniel Brooks had spent 7 years as a federal financial investigator before he left the work entirely. He had sat across tables from men who ran $100 million funds and smiled like they were doing the world a favor. He had learned to read the geometry of a room where the power sat, where the anxiety pooled, which smiles reached the eyes, and which ones were just architecture. He had compiled evidence that sent 4 executives to federal prison, survived 2 credible threats against his career, and testified in proceedings that would have made lesser men reconsider their profession. He had been good at the work. He had also watched it consume his marriage in pieces, and when his wife Laura passed after a long illness during the most demanding stretch of his career, he had not gone back. The guilt of having been elsewhere too often, of having measured his presence in a home by the hours left over from everything else, that guilt had not disappeared. It had changed shape. It had become the particular intensity with which he watched Sophie cross the street, the way he read to her at night, the way he structured his days entirely around her hours. People who met him now sometimes described him as calm. What they were reading was something more precise, a man who had already decided what mattered and organized his life accordingly. Now he owned a bookshop in Brooklyn called Chapter and Verse, and he picked Sophie up from school every afternoon at 3:15, and some nights they read aloud to each other until she fell asleep with her cheek on his arm. That was the life he had chosen. He did not miss the other one. The elevator doors opened, and 2 waitstaff stepped out carrying silver trays, momentarily blocking his sightline toward the far end of the lobby. When they cleared, Daniel noticed a woman standing apart from the flow of guests near a potted olive tree beside the corridor entrance. She wore a midnight blue dress with clean, severe lines, the kind of dress designed to signal authority rather than decoration. Her posture was controlled, her expression composed, but she was gripping her small evening bag with both hands, and her knuckles were white. Daniel noticed this the way he noticed most things, without deciding to, without acting on it, with the automatic cataloging instinct of a man who had spent years reading rooms for a living. He looked away. Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Dad, that lady is looking at you." "Don't stare," he said. "She's the one staring." He did not look back. But he heard the soft footsteps approaching across the marble floor, and when a hand closed gently around his forearm, firm, deliberate, the grip of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it, he turned. She was close. Closer than a stranger had any reasonable business being. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and underneath the composure, she was working hard to maintain frightened in a way that had nothing to do with social anxiety and everything to do with something real and immediate. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. "I know this is an unusual thing to ask." A pause. The kind that meant she had rehearsed what came next and was still not sure it was the right move. "Pretend you're my husband tonight." Daniel looked at her. He looked at the hand on his arm. He looked past her shoulder toward the ballroom corridor, where a man in a charcoal suit had just appeared at the top of the escalator and was scanning the lobby with the slow, methodical patience of someone who expected to find what he was looking for. Daniel looked back at the woman. "No," he said. He watched something flicker in her expression. Not surprise, but the particular resignation of someone who had anticipated rejection and was already calculating the next option. She released his arm. She straightened. She was about to turn away. Then Sophie, who had been watching all of this with the quiet attention of a child who understood more than adults gave her credit for, said, "Dad, look at his eyes." Daniel looked at the man in the charcoal suit again, and this time he understood exactly what Sophie meant. The man was not looking for a lost companion. He was not scanning for a familiar face in a crowd. He was tracking, precise, unhurried, the gaze of a predator who already knew his prey had nowhere to go. The woman beside Daniel had not moved. She was still standing with her back to the corridor, very still, as if stillness might buy her another 30 seconds. Daniel made a decision. "What's your name, sir?" he said. She turned back. "Charlotte," she said. "Charlotte Hayes." "Daniel Brooks." He took a measured breath. "Tell me what's happening. Quickly." Charlotte Hayes had been the CEO of Meridian Biotech for 6 years. She had built the company from a mid-tier research firm into a publicly traded enterprise with a market capitalization that made serious people pay attention. She had negotiated with hospital systems, argued before federal review boards, and once delivered a keynote address 48 hours after emergency surgery with nothing but strong coffee and a carefully applied poker face. She was not a woman who scared easily. Victor Kane scared her. She did not say all of this to Daniel in the 90 seconds she had before Victor reached the base of the escalator. She said, "He's my ex. He's on our board through a proxy company. He's been positioning for a hostile takeover, and he has something on me that isn't true, but looks true enough to destroy my credibility with the other shareholders. Tonight, he's going to try to use it in front of people who matter." A breath. "If I'm here alone, I'm a target. If I'm not alone..." "He backs off," Daniel said, "at least for tonight." Daniel glanced at Sophie, who was watching him with the focused calm of a child who trusted her father's judgment entirely. "Stay close to me," he said to Sophie, then to Charlotte, "Follow my lead." Charlotte opened her mouth possibly to ask what his lead was going to be, but Victor Kane had reached the lobby floor, and there was no more time for questions. Victor Kane was 6'2", silver-haired at the temples, and wore his wealth the way some men wore cologne, not as an accessory, but as a statement about the nature of the world. He moved through the lobby with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no in a context that cost him anything. He was charming the way expensive things are charming. You were aware at some level that the pleasantness was a surface and something else entirely lived underneath. But the surface was so well maintained that most people never bothered to look. He saw Charlotte. His face arranged itself into warmth. He saw Daniel beside her. The warmth became something more careful. "Charlotte," he said, crossing the remaining distance between them with unhurried steps, "I didn't know you were bringing someone." Daniel did not wait for Charlotte to respond. He put his hand on the small of Charlotte's back, gently, naturally, the way a man does when he and the woman beside him have done this particular dance long enough that it requires no thought. He felt Charlotte go very still at the contact, then consciously relax against it. She was quick. He gave her credit for that. "Victor Kane," Daniel said, extending his free hand. "Daniel Brooks, good to meet you." Victor took the handshake. His grip was calibrated firm enough to signal dominance, controlled enough to look friendly. Daniel matched it exactly and let go first. "I don't believe I've heard Charlotte mention you," Victor said pleasantly. "She wouldn't," Daniel said. "We prefer to keep things quiet. Charlotte values her privacy." "That she does." Victor's eyes moved to Sophie, who was standing at Daniel's side holding her concert program, watching Victor with the thoughtful, slightly unsettling attention of a child who had decided she did not like someone and was in the process of determining why. "And this would be..." "My daughter," Daniel said. "Sophie." Sophie looked at Victor. "Hello," she said politely, and then turned back to her concert program with the elegant finality of a child who had completed her social obligation and moved on. Victor's charm recalibrated. His eyes returned to Daniel, and in them was the precise calculation of a man who was deciding how seriously to treat an unexpected variable. "Well," he said, "I hope you'll both join us upstairs. There are some people Charlotte should speak with before the evening gets too far along." "Of course," Charlotte said beside Daniel, and her voice was steady. Victor nodded once and moved toward the elevator. The moment his back turned, Charlotte exhaled in a way that was almost inaudible, but not quite. "Thank you," she said, barely a sound. "Don't thank me yet," Daniel said. "He's not done." He was not done. They rode the elevator to the ballroom level. Sophie between Daniel and Charlotte, holding Charlotte's hand without being asked. Charlotte looked down at the small hand in hers with an expression she quickly smoothed away, but Daniel caught at a flash of something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with strategy. The 32nd floor was everything the lobby had promised. Champagne circulated on trays held by staff who had been trained to be invisible. The floral arrangements were 6 feet tall and constructed in shades of cream and ivory that probably had names Daniel did not know. The guests moved in the particular way of people who had arrived already knowing the outcome of the evening, who would close what deal, who would be seen by whom, who would leave with what. Charlotte was known here. People turned as she entered. Greetings were exchanged that sounded warm and were almost certainly not. She moved through it with practiced ease, Daniel at her side, and he watched the room adjust to his presence the way a room adjusts to something unexpected, with a low-level recalibration, a subtle repositioning of assumptions. He was not one of them. His suit was good, but not bespoke. He carried no particular name. And yet, he was beside Charlotte Hayes, who was absolutely one of them, and that meant something was being silently processed by everyone in the room. An older woman intercepted them near the first set of tables. She was perhaps 65, dressed in the kind of restrained elegance that communicated old money without having to announce it. Her hair was silver and perfectly set. Her eyes moved from Charlotte to Daniel with a speed and precision that reminded Daniel briefly of Victor. "Charlotte," she said. "Mother," Charlotte said. Helen Hayes looked at Daniel with the expression of a woman who had encountered a great number of disappointments in her life and had become exceptionally good at identifying them quickly. "And you are," she said. "Daniel Brooks," he said. "It's a pleasure, Mrs. Hayes." "Is it?" she said, not a question. Sophie, who had been quietly evaluating Helen Hayes for approximately 8 seconds, tugged Daniel's sleeve and whispered at a volume calibrated exactly for the adults around her to hear, "She doesn't seem very pleased." Charlotte made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Helen Hayes looked at Sophie for a long moment, then at Daniel, then at Charlotte. Her expression shifted in a way that was hard to categorize, not warmth exactly, but a pause, an unexpected interruption in the program. "I'd like to speak with my daughter," she said to Daniel. "Of course," Daniel said easily. "Sophie and I will get a look at the view." He guided Sophie gently toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Midtown Manhattan, the city laid out below in its precise, indifferent grid, and he positioned himself where he could see Charlotte and Helen in his peripheral vision without appearing to watch them. "She's unhappy," Sophie said quietly, looking out at the lights. "Helen, Charlotte." She tilted her head. "She's unhappy the way you were unhappy, after Mom." Daniel looked at his daughter. "That's very observant," he said. "I know," Sophie said, and returned to looking at the city. Across the room, Victor Kane was not looking at Charlotte anymore. He was watching Daniel. Daniel noticed this without turning around. He had a particular sensitivity to being observed, the residual awareness of years spent in rooms where being watched meant something was about to happen. He cataloged the information and held it. Victor spoke briefly to a man Daniel did not recognize. 50s compact, the kind of man who existed in the background of powerful rooms and was never as forgettable as he appeared. They exchanged perhaps 15 words. The other man nodded once and moved away. Whatever move Victor was planning for tonight, it had just been set in motion. Daniel thought about Charlotte's 90-second summary in the lobby. He thought about what she had said, "He has something on me that isn't true, but looks true enough." He thought about the precision of Victor's movement through the room, the way he had already mapped the exits, the cameras, the clusters of influence. The man had the patient proprietary comfort of someone who had walked into this evening knowing how it would end, because he had constructed each step of the sequence in advance. He was not improvising. He had come tonight with a specific architecture of events in mind, and he had probably rehearsed the variations. The question was whether Daniel had enough to interrupt the sequence, before it reached its conclusion. He was considering this when Charlotte appeared beside him, having extracted herself from whatever her mother had required of her. Her jaw was tight in a way that suggested the conversation had not improved her evening. "She wants me to send you home," Charlotte said quietly. "I imagine she does. She thinks you're going to embarrass me. Is she wrong?" Charlotte looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since the lobby. Not as a prop, not as a temporary solution, but as an actual person standing next to her, whose presence she was trying to understand. "No," she said finally, "I don't think she is wrong, but I think embarrassment is the least of my problems tonight." "Tell me about the evidence," Daniel said. "What does he have?" Charlotte's expression shifted, the particular shift of someone deciding whether to trust. It was a real decision Daniel could see, not a performance. She was doing the calculation in real time. How much did she need to say, and to whom, and what did it cost her? "There are financial records des sources," she said. "Transactions that were supposed to be internal R&D transfers. They look like something else if you remove the context. 3 board members have already received a preliminary document suggesting I approved fraudulent disbursements. Framed. Professionally." A pause. Victor used to work in structured finance. He knows how to build a narrative out of numbers. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "What was the original context," he asked, "for the transactions?" "A government partnership project. Classified level. The documentation proving the legitimate use is under NDA and can't be shared without federal authorization. So you can't defend yourself without triggering a disclosure violation, which is exactly why he chose those particular transactions." She looked at him. "You understood that quickly." "I've seen it before," Daniel said. And then, because he had decided something, he added, "I need you to give me access to what you can share. Anything that doesn't touch the NDA, internal board communications, his proxy company filings, anything." Charlotte studied him. "Who are you?" she said, "actually." Before he could answer, the room changed. Victor Kane stepped onto the low platform at the far end of the ballroom, where the event moderator stood, and with a smile that filled the room with practiced ease, he said, "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment." The room complied. Rooms always did with Victor. "I want to acknowledge someone who has been an extraordinary leader in the biotech space," he said warmly, and several people began to turn toward Charlotte with the anticipatory warmth of people expecting a compliment. "Charlotte Hayes has built something remarkable at Meridian, which is exactly why it's so important that the board exercise proper oversight moving forwards." The warmth in the room recalibrated quickly. "There are questions," Victor said, still smiling, "that the full board has a responsibility to address, and I think the right time to begin that conversation is now, when so many of the relevant stakeholders happen to be present." Charlotte had gone completely still beside Daniel. The compact man from earlier was now positioned near the far table, distributing something envelopes Daniel realized, which meant the preliminary document Charlotte had mentioned was about to become a room-wide event. This was the moment. Victor had planned it precisely, public documented, witnessed by the exact people whose opinions shaped the market. A CEO accused in front of her own investors with fabricated evidence in their hands and no way to defend herself without triggering a federal disclosure violation. Daniel stepped forward, not aggressively, not dramatically. He moved the way he had always moved in high-pressure rooms, with the calm economy of someone who had decided what to do and was simply doing it. He walked to the edge of the platform and turned to face the room, and the room, startled, went quiet. "I apologize for interrupting," Daniel said pleasantly in the tone of a man who is not the least bit sorry. "I just want to take a moment to respond to something Mr. Kane mentioned." Victor's smile held but became something else underneath. "My name is Daniel Brooks." "No?" he said to the room. "I'm Charlotte's husband." He paused, let that settle, and then added, "And I have a background in federal financial investigation, 14 years primarily structured fraud and fabricated transaction audits." Another pause. "So when my wife's professional reputation is being addressed publicly, I want the room to know that anything placed in those envelopes is something I'll be examining very closely, personally, with the kind of attention I once applied to work that put people in federal prison." The room was not just quiet. It was the specific silence of 200 people reassessing a situation in real time. Victor's smile had not moved, but the certainty behind it had. Daniel turned back to face him directly. "Actually, Daniel, Daniel said, and his voice was perfectly level. "I think I'll stay longer than tonight." The words landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, with a small, precise disturbance that spread outward in every direction. Several things happened simultaneously. Helen Hayes, who had been standing with a group of women near the bar, set down her champagne glass. The compact man who had been distributing envelopes stopped moving, looked at Victor, and waited. Charlotte, standing behind Daniel, felt something shift in the architecture of the evening, a structural rearrangement of who was positioned where, who held the leverage, who had been caught in the middle of something they had not fully anticipated. And Victor Kane, for the first time in what was likely a considerable number of years, looked at someone and was not entirely sure he was looking at a manageable problem. "Interesting introduction," Victor said, and his tone was still pleasant, still capable of convincing a casual observer that nothing significant had just occurred. "I wasn't aware Charlotte had remarried." "Quiet ceremony," Daniel said. "We prefer it that way." "Of course." Victor descended from the platform with unhurried steps. "I look forward to getting to know you better, Daniel, though I have to say the biotech world can be complicated for people outside the industry." "I appreciate the warning," Daniel said. "I found that complicated is usually just a word for well disguised." A ripple of something moved through the guests closest to them. Not laughter exactly, but the social acknowledgement that a point had been scored. Victor's eyes held Daniel's for a moment that lasted longer than comfortable. Then he turned away. The compact man at the far table quietly gathered the envelopes back into a case. In the hours that followed, while Charlotte navigated the room with the careful efficiency of someone who has just been handed an unexpected reprieve and intends to use every second of it, Daniel made sure Sophie had something to eat from the dessert table. She chose a small chocolate tart and ate it with the focused pleasure of someone who intended to remember it, and he thought. He was thinking about Victor Kane. More precisely, he was thinking about a case file he had not thought about in nearly 5 years. A structured fraud investigation that had run parallel to a much larger securities case in the mid-2000s involving a hedge fund that had been quietly dismantling the pension holdings of 3 Midwestern manufacturers while publicly reporting exceptional returns. The lead name on the fund had been Kane Capital. The investigation had stalled when the primary witness, a junior analyst who had been prepared to testify, abruptly recanted and disappeared from the proceedings. Daniel had always suspected why. He had never been able to prove it. He had left the agency before the case closed, or more accurately, before the case was buried. Victor Kane. The name had been in front of him in the lobby, and he had not connected it immediately. It had been years, and the fund had been one of a dozen concurrent investigations, and Daniel had been a different person then in a different life. But standing in the ballroom now, watching Victor work the room with the same precise, unhurried magnetism that Daniel remembered from deposition transcripts, it settled into place. He knew who Victor Kane was, and more importantly, he knew what Victor Kane had done. Daniel found a quiet corner and called an old colleague whose name he did not say aloud, and whose number he had not deleted because he had always suspected he would need it again someday. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Daniel had confirmed 3 things. Kane Capital's current fund structure included a shell company called Meridian Advisory Partners. Meridian Advisory Partners held a non-voting observer seat on the Meridian Biotech Board through a proxy arrangement that had been filed in Delaware 18 months ago. And the original Kane Capital securities fraud case, the one Daniel had worked, the one that had stalled, had been reopened quietly by a federal task force 8 months ago, following new testimony from a source whose identity remained sealed. Victor was not just threatening Charlotte's company. Victor was conducting a financial extraction while under active federal scrutiny, which meant either he did not know he was being watched or he had concluded the extraction would be complete before the scrutiny produced consequences. Neither scenario was good for Charlotte. Daniel returned to the ballroom. Charlotte found him near the window where Sophie had fallen asleep in an upholstered chair, her concert program folded under her cheek, her breathing slow and even. Charlotte looked at Sophie for a moment before she spoke. 3 board members came to me in the last hour, she said quietly. They didn't open the envelopes. They said they wanted to hear from me directly before they made any assessments. Good, Daniel said. What did you say to the room earlier about federal investigation? Was that real? Yes, he said. She was quiet. "What's your connection to Victor?" He told her. Not everything, not the name of his colleague or the specifics of the reopened case, but enough. He told her about Kane Capital, about the pension fund dismantling, about the witness who recanted. He kept his voice low and watched her face as she processed it. Charlotte Hayes was intelligent in the way that matters most under pressure. She could receive information that rearranged everything she thought she knew and incorporate it without losing her footing. He had worked with people who fell apart at less. "He chose my company specifically," she said. He said when he finished, "Possibly, or your company was the best available vehicle at the time and you were incidental to the structure. I don't know which yet." "Does it matter?" "It matters for how you defend yourself," he said. "If you're a target, he'll escalate. If you're a vehicle, there's a chance he pivots when the resistance cost exceeds the expected return." Charlotte looked at Sophie again. Something in her expression was difficult to read in the low light. "She's extraordinary," she said. "She really is," Daniel said. A pause. "Why are you still here, Daniel?" Charlotte asked. And it was a genuine question, not a tactical one. "You stepped in, you redirected the room, you've done more than I asked. You could take her home." He thought about it honestly before he answered. "Because Victor Kane ruined a case I cared about," he said. "And because the look on your face in the lobby wasn't the look of someone in a business dispute. It was the look of someone who was afraid, actually afraid, and didn't have anyone in the room." He paused. "And because my daughter thinks you're unhappy. Sophie's read on people is very good." Charlotte laughed quietly, briefly, but genuinely, and the sound of it surprised both of them. "Ah!" Sophie woke at 11:30 with the disoriented calm of a child who had fallen asleep in one context and was now processing another. She found herself covered with a folded event program jacket, Charlotte's, Daniel suspected, and looked around until she located her father. "Are we still here?" she asked. "Almost done," he said. She looked at Charlotte, who was seated across the small table, reviewing something on her phone with focused attention. Sophie watched her for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" Sophie asked Charlotte. Charlotte looked up. Something crossed her face. "I think so," she said, "because of your dad." Sophie considered this. "He's good at that," she said matter-of-factly, "fixing things without making a big deal about it." Charlotte glanced at Daniel. He looked at the ceiling. "That's an accurate summary," Charlotte said. The move Victor had not anticipated came from Sophie. It was not dramatic. It did not involve anything a child should not have seen or heard. Sophie had simply been awake, more awake than the adults realized during a specific 3-minute window around 11 o'clock, when she had been sitting quietly in the upholstered chair, and Victor had been standing near the table cluster to her left, speaking in a low voice to the compact man whose name Sophie had heard very clearly. Arthur Wynne. She had also heard Victor say, "When the filing goes through the morning window before the opening bell. Once it's registered, the board challenge is automatic." She had not understood what this meant, but she had understood that her father would want to know it. She told Daniel at 11:45 while Charlotte was in a brief conversation with a departing guest. Daniel was very still for a moment. Then he excused himself for 6 minutes, made 2 calls, and returned with an expression that had not changed at all, which Charlotte had already learned meant that something significant had been decided. The next 72 hours were not the ballroom. They were boardrooms and document requests, and 2 conversations with Charlotte's outside legal team that lasted past midnight. They were Daniel at a desk in Charlotte's office building with a stack of proxy filing records and the quiet, absolute focus of a man who had once done this for a living and had not entirely lost the fluency. The work had a particular texture. He remembered the careful dismantling of something that had been constructed to look solid, the satisfaction of finding the single thread that, when pulled, reorganized the entire visible surface into something that could no longer hold. Victor's structure was elegant. Daniel gave him that. The shell company arrangement was 3 layers deep, the beneficial ownership obscured behind 2 holding entities in jurisdictions that cooperated selectively with American disclosure requests. The fabricated transaction narrative targeting Charlotte's disbursements was constructed from selectively extracted documents that looked damning without their context and innocuous with it. But Victor had made an assumption that turned out to be incorrect. He had assumed that Charlotte's NDA around the government project meant the original transaction documents were permanently inaccessible. Daniel knew someone. More precisely, Daniel knew the process by which a former federal investigator could request an emergency disclosure review in connection with an active investigation, the reopened Kane Capital case, which his colleague had confirmed that could potentially release specific documentation under seal for limited evidentiary purposes. It was not fast, it was not guaranteed, but it was real and it existed, and Victor had not planned for it. Arthur Wynn's morning window filing, which Sophie had overheard, was a board challenge mechanism. If it filed successfully before the market opened, it triggered an automatic governance review that would freeze Charlotte's operational authority for a minimum of 45 days, enough time for Victor to complete the extraction and restructure before any investigation could catch up. The filing needed to be preempted.
Oh?
Charlotte's outside counsel filed an emergency injunction at 4:40 in the morning on Saturday, supported by a preliminary disclosure letter from the federal oversight process Daniel had initiated, which confirmed that the transactions in question were under active governmental review and could not be used as the basis of a private governance action without prejudice to ongoing proceedings. It was enough. Arthur Wynn's filing, submitted at 6:15 when the sun was beginning to touch the upper floors of Midtown buildings, and the city was still deciding whether it was awake yet, was flagged by the filing system held for regulatory review and referred to the same federal task force within 90 minutes. Victor Kane learned about it at 9:03, which was roughly when his attorney called him, with the kind of careful, measured language that lawyers use when they are trying to communicate that a plan has failed, without using words that might later appear in a transcript. Daniel was at his bookshop in Brooklyn at 9:15, opening the front door and turning the sign from closed to open when his phone buzzed once with a message from his federal colleague. It read, "Package received. Wheels turning. You didn't hear it from me." He read it twice, put the phone in his pocket and began straightening the display in the front window, a set of late autumn titles he had been meaning to arrange for 2 weeks. Sophie came downstairs from the apartment above the shop at 9:30, still in her pajamas, and sat on the small stool behind the counter with a bowl of cereal. "Is it done?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "Is she safe?" He thought about Charlotte, who had called at 7 in the morning to tell him about the injunction and had used the word extraordinary 3 times in under a minute before apparently deciding that was excessive and stopping herself. "She's going to be fine," he said. Sophie ate a spoonful of cereal. "Good," she said, and opened a book. The weeks that followed were quieter than the weeks that had come before, which was the natural consequence of a particular kind of storm passing. Victor Kane's board challenge had not simply failed, it had drawn federal attention to proxy filing activity that connected with the methodical patience of an evidence trail to the original Kane Capital investigation. The hedge fund's current structures were being examined. Arthur Wynn had retained his own attorney, which was always an indication that cooperation with investigators was being considered. Victor Kane himself had issued no public statements. Charlotte's board had, after the injunction and the clarifying documentation that followed, voted to table any governance review pending the completion of the federal inquiry. 3 members had reached out to Charlotte personally to express support. One of them, a 73-year-old board veteran named George Alderman, who had served on public company boards for decades, had told her, "I always thought there was something off about Kane. I should have said so sooner." Charlotte had thanked him and meant it. She had also thought briefly about what it meant that a man she met for 90 seconds in a hotel lobby had done more to protect her company in 4 days than 3 years of careful board management had managed. Helen Hayes called Charlotte on a Tuesday morning, which was Helen's habitual time for delivering assessments of other people's choices. The man, Helen Hayes said, "Daniel," Charlotte said. "Yes." A pause. "Is he actually your husband?" "Mother, I'm asking a direct question." "No," Charlotte said. "He's not. He's someone I met at the Grand Regent." She paused. "He's a good person." Helen was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than her usual silences. "The child," she said finally. "Sophie. She spoke to me for 8 minutes at the event, about the orchestra. She knows a remarkable amount about string instruments for an 8-year-old. Her mother was a musician. Charlotte said. Another silence. He seemed, Helen said carefully, like someone who doesn't particularly care what rooms think of him. He doesn't, Charlotte said. That is, Helen said, with the particular reluctance of a woman revising a long-standing position actually quite difficult to find. Charlotte waited. You could invite them for dinner, Helen said, as if this were a logistical suggestion rather than an endorsement. At some point, if it seems appropriate. Charlotte said she would consider it. After she hung up, she sat for a moment at her desk and looked out at the city, which had the unremarkable beauty it always had on clear mornings, and thought about the fact that life sometimes reorganized itself in 4 days in ways that years of careful planning had not managed to accomplish. Chapter and verse was on a quiet block in Carroll Gardens between a plant shop and a dry cleaning establishment with a green door and a handwritten sign in the window that said, "Open most days, closed when we need to be." Sophie had made the sign herself in 2nd grade, and Daniel had kept it because it was accurate. Charlotte came in on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks after the Grand Regent evening. She had not called ahead, which she acknowledged was probably not ideal, but which she had done anyway, because she had been walking past the block twice already, and recognized that the only cure for that particular problem was to actually go in. The shop smelled of old paper and something warm coffee from the small machine on the counter maybe, or just the accumulated warmth of a place that had been used consistently and lovingly for years. The shelves were well organized, but not fussy. There were handwritten recommendation cards throughout in 2 different sets of handwriting. Sophie was behind the counter doing homework and looked up when Charlotte entered. "Hi," Sophie said. "We have the new Alderman novel if you're looking for it. People keep asking." "Actually, I came to see your dad," Charlotte said. "He's in the back." Sophie returned to her homework, then looked up again. "He won't say it, but he talks about you. To me, so." Charlotte smiled. "Good things, I hope." "Mostly." Sophie tilted her head. "He said you're very precise under pressure. He said that's rare." "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me in years," Charlotte said. Daniel emerged from the back room with a stack of books and stopped when he saw her. His expression did what Charlotte had come to recognize as his particular version of surprise, nearly invisible, communicated only by a brief stillness before everything settled. "Charlotte," he said. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. "No, you weren't," he said pleasantly. "No," she admitted, "I wasn't." He set the books on the counter, and Sophie very deliberately gathered her homework and announced that she was going to work on it upstairs with the obvious and complete non-subtlety of a child managing a situation she had decided she approved of. Her footsteps on the staircase were unhurried and deliberate, each one the sound of a person who has made a decision and is comfortable with it. They stood in the quiet of the shop after Sophie's footsteps faded overhead. "How's the company?" he asked. "Stable. Alderman has been quietly talking to the other board members. Victor hasn't surfaced." She paused. "My attorney says the federal inquiry is moving in a direction that's discouraging for Victor's particular interests. I suspect it will continue to move that way. Because of you. Because of a process that was already in motion," he said. "I just knew where to connect the existing evidence to the existing inquiry. You do that thing," she said, "where you distribute credit until there's none left for yourself." He was quiet for a moment. "Sophie does it too," Charlotte said. "She learned it somewhere," he conceded. They had coffee. Charlotte sat in the armchair nearest the window, while Daniel leaned against the counter, and outside the city moved in its ordinary Saturday way, unhurried, indifferent to the small number of people inside who were in the middle of something neither of them had language for yet. The shop was warm in the particular way of places that are used consistently, not maintained at a temperature, but inhabited into warmth accumulated by daily presence. Charlotte told him about a board restructuring. She was planning a new committee oversight framework that would prevent the kind of proxy arrangement Victor had used from being viable in the future. She was precise and clear about it, and he listened the way he listened to everything with the full, unperformed attention of someone for whom listening was a primary skill rather than a courtesy. He told her about a book he had been reading, A History of Financial Regulation in the 1980s, that had been written by a former Treasury official and was funnier than it had any right to be. She said she wanted to read it. He handed it to her. They were quiet for a moment, and the quiet was comfortable in the specific way that comfortable quiet takes years to develop between people and almost never arrives this quickly. "I want to say thank you properly," Charlotte said, "not for the Grand Regent, For everything after. For the calls, the filings, the nights you spent on documentation that you had no obligation to. You're welcome, he said. I'm not finished. You are actually, he said gently, you don't owe me anything. I helped because I wanted to. That's the entire transaction. She looked at him. You are genuinely unusual, she said. That's what Sophie tells me. The sound of small feet on the stairs preceded Sophie's reappearance at the threshold. She looked at both of them with the evaluating calm of a child taking stock. Are you staying for dinner? She asked Charlotte with the directness of someone who had already decided the answer she preferred. Charlotte looked at Daniel. He spread his hand slightly. Your call. If it's not an imposition, Charlotte said. It's not, Sophie said definitively, and disappeared back upstairs evidently to begin making whatever preparations an 8-year-old made for this kind of occasion. The months that followed were not a story with a clear beginning and a clean ending. They were quieter than that and more gradual and more real. Victor Kane's legal situation continued to develop in the methodical way that federal inquiries develop, not quickly, not with the drama of a courtroom scene, but with the accumulating weight of evidence properly assembled and procedures properly followed. By February, 2 members of his fund's advisory board had entered cooperation agreements. Arthur Wynne had retained a second attorney. Victor's public profile, which had been maintained with considerable care for many years, had become significantly quieter. Meridian Biotech completed a quarterly earnings report that exceeded analyst expectations and was noted in several industry publications as evidence of stable leadership. Charlotte accepted a keynote invitation to a biotech innovation conference. George Alderman told her over lunch that he intended to recommend her for a national industry advisory board. Helen Hayes came to dinner at Charlotte's apartment in March and spent 45 minutes in focused conversation with Sophie about the history of the violin, a topic on which Sophie had developed over the winter months a degree of knowledge that impressed even people who expected to be impressed by nothing. On a Sunday in April, Daniel arrived at the bookshop at 9 in the morning to find a note from Sophie on the counter, gone to the farmer's market with Charlotte. Back by 11. Left coffee. He poured the coffee, opened a book, and sat in the armchair by the window. Through the glass he could see the block's particular morning light, which was the kind of light that made everything look like it had been there forever and would stay there indefinitely. He thought about a lobby in a hotel and a woman gripping her evening bag with both hands, and a question whispered close enough that he could hear the fear underneath it. He thought about everything that had happened after. Huh? Sophie came back at 10:50 carrying a paper bag that smelled of bread with Charlotte behind her. She set the bag on the counter and looked at her father in the armchair. You're doing your thinking face, she said. Was it, he said. I'm reading it, he said. You're doing your thinking face while holding a book. She sat on the counter stool. What are you thinking about, boo? He looked at Charlotte, who was hanging up her coat and pretending to examine the new arrivals shelf with great interest. I was thinking, he said, about how things start. Sophie considered this. You mean like how you and Charlotte started with the pretending? Charlotte did not quite look up from the shelf. Something like that, Daniel said. Sophie tilted her head. The inherited gesture, the thing Laura had done, and looked at him with the precision of a child who was very close to saying something exact. Are you still pretending? She asked. The shop was quiet. The morning light came through the window at a low angle that made the dust motes visible, and the paperbacks looked like they held better answers than they did. Daniel looked up Then he looked at Charlotte, who had turned from the shelf and was watching him with dark, careful eyes and the expression of someone who has asked a question they are not sure they want answered, except that they absolutely are. No, Daniel said, and the quiet held. Some things are not dramatic at their center. The real ones rarely are. The real ones are two people standing in the light of an ordinary morning with the particular certainty that comes from having already seen each other, clearly, not in the flattering conditions, not in the managed impressions, but under pressure in the dark, when the cost was real and the choices were not hypothetical. When there was no performance left to maintain, and what remained was simply what was actually there. Charlotte Hayes had spent 20 years building something she believed in, and she had learned that strength was not about having no fear. It was about fear not being the last word. Daniel Brooks had spent 7 years building a different kind of life from the rubble of another one, and he had learned that protection was not about controlling outcomes. It was about being present when the moment required it. and about having the patience to trust afterward what presence had made possible. Sophie Brooks, who was 8 years old and had strong opinions about string instruments and farmers markets and the reliability of fathers, understood something that the adults in her life were still working out, that the best things do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly on ordinary days, and they stay. A woman whispered a question in a hotel lobby. A man did far more than just say yes. And in a bookshop in Brooklyn on a Sunday morning in April, with bread on the counter and coffee going cold in the city, doing what the city always did. Something that had started as a performance became, without drama, without fanfare, without anything but two people and a child, and the accumulated honesty of several difficult months entirely real.